They thought humans would stay out of their war. We showed them wrong. The galaxy burned with a war that had lasted 73 years, and nobody could remember anymore why it started or what they were really fighting for. On one side of this endless conflict stood the Velcran Dominion, and these creatures looked like massive insects with hard shells and 6 arms that could tear through metal like paper. They believed that strength came from numbers, and they threw millions of soldiers at their enemies without caring how many died, because there were always more Velcran being born to replace the fallen. On the other side fought the Ascari coalition, and these beings were tall and thin with large heads that held brains capable of telepathy and mind tricks that could make entire enemy battalions surrender without firing a shot. The Ascari fought with coordination that seemed almost magical because every soldier in their army could share thoughts instantly across vast distances of space, and they moved like a single organism with a million bodies. Between these two powers sat humanity, and the humans were new to this galactic stage, having only achieved faster than light travel 15 years ago, when the great ships from Earth first jumped into systems where alien civilizations had existed for thousands of years. The reaction was mixed, with some species welcoming them and others watching with suspicion. The Galactic Council, which claimed to be neutral and above the war, had immediately sent representatives to Earth with a simple message that humanity should stay out of the conflict and focus on trade and exploration, and building a future that did not involve the bloodshed consuming half the known galaxy. Commander Jake Morrison stood in the command center of Earth Defense Fleet headquarters, and he was a man in his late 40s with gray starting to show at his temples and lines around his eyes from years of military service. He had read the reports about the war and seen the casualty numbers and watched footage of destroyed worlds, and he knew that humanity was not ready for this kind of conflict. Earth had barely mastered interstellar travel, and their weapons were primitive compared to what the Velcran and Ascari could bring to bear, and their fleet numbered in the dozens while the warring powers counted their ships in the thousands. So Morrison had agreed to the Galactic Council terms and signed the neutrality agreement and told his officers that humanity would watch and learn but not interfere. Captain Lisa Bennett commanded a ship called the Horizon, and it was a diplomatic vessel designed for peacekeeping missions and humanitarian aid rather than warfare. She was 36 years old with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and sharp green eyes that missed nothing, and she had been traveling through the neutral zones for 3 years now. Every week brought new horrors to witness as refugee ships, packed with dying civilians, crossed through human-patrolled space, and Lisa would order her medical teams to help who they could while knowing it was never enough. She had seen entire star systems reduced to asteroid fields and planets where the atmosphere had been burned away by orbital bombardment, and children who would never see their parents again because the war had taken everything from them. The Velcran tried to recruit humanity first by sending ambassadors who promised advanced technology and rich territory if Earth would join their cause. They showed humans maps of systems that could be colonized, and weapons that could level cities and warships that could crack planets, and they said that all of this could belong to humanity if they would only fight alongside the Dominion. Commander Morrison listened politely and declined and explained that humanity preferred peace to power. Then the Ascari sent their diplomats, and these ones offered psychic enhancements that could expand human consciousness, and cultural exchanges that would enrich Earth civilization, and a place in their coalition as equals rather than servants. Morrison declined them too with the same polite firmness and reminded everyone that Earth had chosen its path. But neutrality came with a cost that grew heavier every day, and human colonies occasionally found themselves in the crossfire. When Velcran fleets chased Ascari ships through systems that were supposed to be protected, trade vessels were seized by both sides, with the Velcran claiming they carried Ascari supplies and the Ascari insisting they held Velcran intelligence, and the cargo was confiscated either way, leaving human merchants bankrupt and angry. Diplomats like Captain Bennett grew increasingly frustrated as they filed complaint after complaint, with the Galactic Council only to receive sympathetic words and no action, because the Council had no real power, and both warring sides knew it. In the halls of Earth government, a debate raged between those who wanted to maintain neutrality at all costs and those who argued that standing aside while innocents died was itself a moral failure. Politicians gave speeches about responsibility and security, and the future of humanity, and what kind of civilization Earth wanted to become. Military officers ran simulations and drew up contingency plans and trained their forces for a war they hoped would never come, but prepared for anyway, because that was what smart commanders did. Scientists studied captured Velcran and Ascari technology and tried to understand how these species had built such devastating weapons while humanity was still figuring out basic energy. SHIELD's Lieutenant Chris Palmer was stationed on New Haven, which was humanity's most successful colony with a population of 4 million and blue skies and oceans that reminded people of Earth. He was 28 years old and had joined the military to see the stars and found himself instead watching the war from a safe distance while filing endless reports about ship movements and territorial disputes. New Haven sat in the outer reaches, far from the main battle zones, and it was designated as neutral territory under Galactic Council protection, and everyone believed that designation meant something, that the rules of war would be respected even if nothing else was. They were wrong. And on a Tuesday afternoon when the local sun was high and people were going about their normal lives, everything changed. The Velcran Third Fleet appeared in orbit without warning, and their commander claimed that New Haven had been providing intelligence to the Ascari, and that this violation of neutrality could not be ignored. Captain Bennett was 3 systems away when the first reports came through, and she immediately ordered the Horizon to jump to New Haven, but she knew even as she gave the command that they would arrive too late to stop what was about to happen. The Velcran opened fire on the orbital stations, and Lieutenant Palmer was on the surface when the sky lit up with explosions that turned night into day. He watched defense platforms that were designed to stop asteroids try uselessly to fight back against military-grade weapons, and he saw debris begin to rain down on the capital city as the stations broke apart. People were screaming and running and dying, and Palmer grabbed whoever he could and pulled them into shelters, while above them the Velcran fleet methodically destroyed anything that could transmit data or coordinate a defense. When the bombardment finally stopped, 12,000 humans were dead and another 30,000 were injured, and the infrastructure that had taken a decade to build was reduced to smoking ruins in less than 6 hours. God, they thought humans would stay out of their war. We showed them wrong. Captain Lisa Bennett arrived at New Haven 6 hours after the bombardment ended, and what she saw through the view screen made her stomach turn, because entire sections of the capital city were gone and fires burned across the landscape and emergency beacons screamed from 100 different locations. The Horizon moved into orbit, carefully avoiding the debris field that had once been sophisticated defense platforms, and Lisa ordered every medical team on her ship to prepare for immediate deployment. She had seen war zones before, but this was different because these were human bodies in the rubble and human children crying for parents who would never answer in human blood-staining streets that had been peaceful just hours ago. Lieutenant Chris Palmer was still on the surface pulling survivors from collapsed buildings when the Horizon arrived, and his uniform was torn and covered in dust and blood, and his hands were raw from digging through concrete and steel. He had been working without rest since the attack began, and around him other survivors did the same, because there was no time to stop and process what had happened when people were still trapped and dying. Medical shuttles began landing near the worst hit areas, and Palmer directed them to where the need was greatest while trying not to think about the faces of the dead he had already found. Captain Bennett transported down to the surface and walked through the destruction with her security team, and she recorded everything with her personal scanner, because Earth needed to see this, and the Galactic Council needed to see this, and the whole galaxy needed to understand what the Velcran had done. She found Palmer coordinating rescue efforts near what had been a school, and the building was half collapsed and small bodies were being carried out, and Bennett had to turn away for a moment, because even after 3 years of witnessing this war, she was not prepared for dead children. The Velcran commander was still in the system when Bennett contacted him, and his name was something unpronounceable that translated to Sharp Blade of Victory, and he appeared on her screen, looking satisfied with himself. Bennett kept her voice level and professional as she asked why he had attacked a protected neutral colony, and the Velcran commander clicked his mandibles in what might have been laughter. He told her that New Haven had been providing intelligence to the Ascari, and that humanity had violated the neutrality agreement, and that the Dominion had simply enforced the rules of war. Bennett demanded to see the evidence, and the Velcran commander transmitted files that supposedly showed communication between New Haven and Ascari military units, but it took her intelligence officer less than 10 minutes to prove the files were fabricated. The metadata was wrong and the encryption signatures did not match, and the whole thing was a clumsy forgery that insulted their intelligence. When Bennett pointed this out, the Velcran commander simply stated that the evidence was sufficient for their purposes and that humanity should consider this a lesson about staying truly neutral. The truth became clear to everyone watching, and the attack had nothing to do with intelligence or violations of neutrality and everything to do with sending a message. The Velcran wanted to remind the galaxy that even the neutrals could be targets if it served their interests, and that the Galactic Council protection meant nothing when faced with overwhelming military force. New Haven had been convenient and weak, and making an example of a human colony cost the Velcran nothing because what could humanity possibly do in response? Commander Jake Morrison requested an emergency session of the Galactic Council, and representatives from 40 species gathered in the Great Chamber on the Neutral Station, where such meetings were held. Morrison presented the evidence of the attack and the falsified intelligence reports and the death toll that kept rising as more bodies were recovered from the ruins. He spoke calmly and clearly about the 12,000 dead and the 30,000 injured and the 4 million humans on New Haven who would never feel safe again. The council members listened with expressions ranging from sympathy to boredom because they had heard similar stories from dozens of species over 73 years of war. The Velcran representative defended the attack as a legitimate military action against a target that had violated neutrality, and he stuck to this story even when confronted with proof that the evidence was fabricated. The Ascari representative expressed sympathy for human losses, but noted that this was exactly why they had tried to recruit Earth into their coalition, because neutrality offered no real protection. Other council members gave speeches about the tragedy of war and the importance of peace and the need for all species to respect the rights of neutrals, but nobody proposed any concrete action. After 2 days of debate, the Galactic Council issued a formal reprimand to the Velcran Dominion and a strongly worded statement about respecting neutral territories and a reminder that the rules of war existed for good reasons. There were no sanctions and no reparations and no enforcement mechanisms because the Council had no military force of its own, and both the Velcran and Ascari knew that words on documents meant nothing without power to back them up. The reprimand was filed in the official records, where it joined thousands of similar documents that had changed nothing. Lieutenant Palmer was decorated for his rescue efforts and given a medal that felt like an insult because what good was a piece of metal when 12,000 people were dead? Earth media wanted interviews, and Palmer agreed because someone needed to tell the truth, and he stood before cameras from a dozen networks and said what millions of humans were thinking. They had killed our people and they had lied about it, and the galaxy had done nothing, so the question now was what humanity would do in response. His words echoed across human space and on Earth and the colonies and the outposts where humans had built new lives among the stars. Protests erupted in major cities demanding action and justice, and an end to the neutrality that had failed to protect anyone. The families of the New Haven dead organized vigils and marches and petition drives calling on their government to respond with force. Politicians who had argued for neutrality found themselves shouted down in public forums, while those calling for war gained support with every passing day. In the depths of Earth, Defense Fleet Headquarters' old plans were pulled from archives and updated with new intelligence and revised to account for everything humanity had learned by watching this war for 15 years. Officers who had been preparing for a conflict they hoped would never come suddenly found their work taken seriously, and their budgets approved, and their timelines accelerated. Commander Morrison spent 3 days reviewing the operational plans before making his recommendation to the civilian government, and his report was clear and direct and left no room for misunderstanding about what he was proposing. The message he sent to Earth. Leadership was simple, and Morrison stated that humanity had tried neutrality and it had failed, and that the Galactic Council was useless, and that the only language the Velcran understood was force. He recommended that Earth declare war on the Velcran Dominion and prosecute that war with every resource humanity could bring to bear until the Velcran learned that attacking humans carried a price they could not afford to pay, and that lesson needed to be taught quickly and brutally, so that no other species ever made the same mistake. Like they thought humans would stay out of their war, we showed Them Wrong Earth declared war on the Velcran Dominion 3 weeks after the New Haven massacre, and the announcement sent shockwaves through the galaxy because nobody expected the humans to actually do it. The Galactic Council held emergency meetings to discuss this unexpected development, and representatives debated whether humanity understood what they were getting into. The Velcran High Command received the news with something close to amusement because Earth had maybe 20 combat-ready warships while the Dominion fielded thousands, and this looked like suicide rather than strategy. The Ascari sent diplomatic messages, congratulating humanity on making the right choice and offering to coordinate their military efforts as part of the coalition, but the response they got back was not what they expected. Admiral Karen Wells took command of the newly formed First Strike Fleet, and she was 52 years old with silver hair cut military short and eyes that had seen combat on Earth before humanity ever reached the stars. Her orders came directly from Commander Morrison, and they were simple in concept but brutal in execution, which was to make the Velcran regret every human death at New Haven and to do it in a way that the entire galaxy would remember. She had 17 warships under her command, and most military analysts said that was nowhere near enough, but Wells had something the analysts did not account for, which was 15 years of watching this war and taking detailed notes about how both sides fought. The Velcran relied on overwhelming numbers and brute force, and their ships were heavily armored, with thick hulls that could absorb tremendous damage and massive weapons that could crack smaller vessels in half with single shots. Their tactics had not changed in decades because they had never needed to change when throwing enough ships at a problem always eventually solved it. They accepted casualty rates that would horrify human commanders because Velcran populations were vast and replacements were always available, and victory justified any cost. The Ascari had been fighting this approach for 73 years, and they survived by using their telepathic coordination and superior speed, but they could not break the Velcran momentum. Admiral Wells studied the Velcran supply chains and logistics networks and identified weaknesses that the Ascari had never thought to exploit, because the coalition fought for territory and resources, while humanity fought for revenge. She ordered her fleet to Krentar Station, which was a massive supply depot in Velcran space that fed their entire western front with ammunition and fuel and replacement parts. The station was protected by defensive platforms and a garrison fleet, but they were positioned to stop attacks from the direction of Ascari space, not from the neutral zones where no threat was expected. The First Strike Fleet used stealth technology that humanity had developed independently, and it was not as sophisticated as what either warring power possessed, but it was good enough when combined. With clever timing and careful approach vectors, Wells brought her ships in close to an asteroid field that provided cover and then waited until the garrison fleet was at maximum distance during their patrol route. When she gave the order to attack the human ships, appeared inside the defensive perimeter, like ghosts materializing from nothing, and the Velcran had maybe 30 seconds of warning before the shooting started. Human weapons were not as powerful as Velcran guns, but they were accurate, and the targeting systems Earth had developed were better than anything the Dominion used. Wells did not try to destroy the station because that would take too long and invite counterattack, but instead her ships systematically destroyed the supply stockpiles and fuel depots and ammunition bunkers. The Velcran garrison fleet turned back immediately when the alarm was raised, but by the time they arrived, the human ships were already jumping away, and Krentar Station was burning with explosions that would take weeks to fully extinguish. Captain Ryan Hughes commanded the fighter wing aboard the carrier Washington, and he was 31 years old and had been flying combat simulations since he was 18. But this was his first real battle. His mission was to cripple the Velcran shipyards at Horvan Prime, and the plan was insane, but that seemed to be standard procedure for human operations now. Hughes led 48 fighters into Velcran space using drones as decoys, and the drones were programmed to emit the same signatures as human warships, which meant the Velcran defense fleet scrambled to intercept what they thought was a major attack. While the defense fleet was out of position, chasing drones, the real attack came from a different vector as Hughes and his pilots screamed in at maximum speed and launched their entire payload at the construction facilities. Horvan Prime had been producing 6 capital ships per month, and those facilities were delicate because shipbuilding required precision and careful assembly. Human missiles with shaped charges designed specifically for this mission tore through the construction bays and destroyed the framework of 3 ships that were nearly complete and damaged the assembly system so badly that repairs would take months. The Velcran were confused and angry because this was not how wars were supposed to be fought, and where were the grand fleet battles and the honorable combat and the territorial conquest that gave meaning to conflict. The humans did not fight like any species the Dominion had encountered before, and they struck at logistics and infrastructure and support systems rather than seeking glorious battles. Every attack was calculated to cause maximum disruption with minimum risk, and the Velcran began to realize that they were fighting an enemy who did not care about honor or tradition or the established rules of galactic warfare. Lieutenant Sophie Grant had survived New Haven by being off-world when the attack happened, but she lost friends and colleagues in the bombardment, and now she commanded a frigate called the Defiant. Her mission was to blockade Velcran trade routes and strangle their economy, and she executed these orders with cold efficiency. Grant did not engage Velcran warships directly because that would be suicide, but instead her ship and others like it lurked near major shipping lanes and destroyed cargo vessels and mining operations and anything that fed resources into the Velcran war machine. The Dominion tried to protect their trade routes by assigning military escorts, but that meant pulling ships away from the front lines, which was exactly what the humans wanted. Every Velcran warship protecting a cargo convoy was one less ship fighting the Ascari, and the coalition was finally making territorial gains after years of stalemate. The Velcran High Command found themselves fighting a 2-front war where the Ascari pushed from one direction and the humans bled them from another, and neither threat could be ignored. After 6 weeks of operations, Admiral Wells transmitted a message directly to the Velcran homeworld, and her face appeared on every screen in their command centers. She spoke slowly and clearly so that the translation systems would capture every word, and she told them that they had wanted war, and now they were getting a lesson in how humans waged it. She listed every supply depot destroyed and every shipyard crippled and every trade route cut, and then she promised that this was only the beginning because humanity had barely started showing them what real warfare looked like. The 2 Ascari watched these human operations with growing concern because they had assumed Earth would need their help and join their coalition and follow Ascari strategies and command structures. Instead, humanity was winning battles that the Ascari had never considered possible, and doing it with a fraction of the resources the coalition possessed. And they thought humans would stay out of their war. We showed them wrong. The Velcran Dominion made their worst mistake in the 3rd month of the war when they decided that humanity needed to be taught a harder lesson, and that one destroyed colony was clearly not enough to break human resolve. Their military strategists believed that humans were like any other species, and that sufficient brutality would force them to surrender, or at least return to neutrality and beg for peace. They chose Terra Nova as their target because it was the 2nd largest human colony with 3 million inhabitants and important mining operations, and it was close enough to major shipping lanes that its destruction would send a clear message to every neutral species watching. Commander Alex Turner had been given command of Terra Nova's defense just 3 weeks earlier, and he was 40 years old with a background in tactical planning and a mind that saw patterns where others saw chaos. He had studied the New Haven attack for hundreds of hours and reviewed every sensor reading and every decision point and every mistake that had allowed the Velcran to kill so many people. Turner knew the Velcran would come again because that was how they operated, and once they started down a path, they never deviated until something forced them to stop. Terra Nova was ready in ways that New Haven had not been, and Turner had upgraded every defense system and repositioned satellites and trained the civilian population in emergency procedures that nobody wanted to think about, but everyone understood were necessary. When the Velcran fleet appeared in orbit, the warning klaxons were already sounding and people were moving to shelters, and the defense grid was powering up before the first Velcran ship finished its deceleration burn. The Velcran commander expected easy prey, and what he found instead was a world that fought back with coordinated fury that shocked his tactical officers. Defense satellites that looked like standard civilian models revealed themselves as weapons platforms armed with rail guns that had been designed specifically to punch through Velcran armor. The first volley caught 3 capital ships unprepared and tore holes through their hulls that vented atmosphere and crew into space. Ground-based missile systems hidden in what appeared to be mining facilities launched synchronized strikes that crippled two troop transports before they could deploy their soldiers. Commander Turner directed the battle from a command bunker deep, underground, and he watched the tactical displays with grim satisfaction as his preparations proved effective. The Velcran were powerful, but they were also predictable, and Turner had spent weeks gaming out their likely approach vectors and target priorities, and now he was exploiting every weakness in their doctrine. When Velcran fighters moved to suppress the ground defenses, they flew into kill zones where overlapping fields of fire from automated turrets shredded their formations. The Velcran managed to land ground forces on the northern continent, and this was what Sergeant Nicole Brooks had been training for since the day New Haven burned. She was 26 years old and had joined the Colonial Marines right out of school, and she commanded a platoon of 40 soldiers who were dug in along defensive positions that had been carefully prepared over the past weeks. The Velcran soldiers that came down in their drop pods were 7 feet tall with natural armor plating and 4 arms carrying weapons. But Brooks and her people had trained specifically to fight this enemy. Human soldiers were physically weaker than Velcran warriors, but they had better weapons and superior tactics and a willingness to use every advantage, no matter how small. Brooks coordinated her platoon through helmet comms, and they fought from prepared positions using crossfire lanes and interlocking fields of fire that turned the Velcran advance into a nightmare. When Velcran soldiers tried to charge the human lines, they ran into mines and automated gun emplacements and precision fire from soldiers who had been trained to aim for the weak points in Velcran anatomy. The battle for the northern defensive line lasted 16 hours, and Brooks held her position through wave after wave of Velcran attacks because giving ground meant letting the enemy reach the civilian shelters behind her. She lost soldiers too, Velcran weapons, and watched friends die, but the line held because every human fighter understood what was at stake. The Velcran had never encountered humans in ground combat before, and they learned quickly that superior strength meant nothing against opponents who refused to fight on Velcran terms. The Velcran fleet tried to break the orbital defenses through sustained bombardment, but Turner had designed his defense grid with redundancy and distributed command systems that meant destroying one satellite did not cripple the network. Every time the Velcran concentrated fire on one section, the other satellites adjusted their positions and maintained coverage, and the railguns kept firing and kept scoring hits on ships that were designed to absorb punishment from Ascari energy weapons, but not from kinetic rounds traveling at relativistic speeds. After 2 days of fighting, the Velcran commander realized that taking Terra Nova would cost more ships and soldiers than the Dominion could afford to lose, and that the humans had turned this colony into a fortress that would bleed his fleet dry. He ordered a retreat, and his remaining ships jumped away, leaving behind thousands of dead Velcran soldiers and 3 destroyed capital ships that would burn up in Terra Nova's atmosphere over the coming weeks. The victory was complete, and for the first time in the 73-year war, a Velcran assault had been completely repelled by a force smaller than their own. The galaxy took notice of what happened at Terra Nova, and military analysts from every species began studying human tactics and defense strategies and trying to understand how such a young civilization had accomplished what the Ascari had failed to do for 7 decades. News networks broadcast footage of the battle, and of Sergeant Brooks and her platoon defending their positions, and of Commander Turner directing a defense that had seemed impossible. The Velcran were supposed to be unstoppable when they committed to an assault, and humans had stopped them cold. Admiral Wells pressed the advantage immediately, and the first strike fleet had grown to 42 ships as Earth ramped up warship production and recalled vessels from exploration missions. She began coordinating with Ascari forces, not as subordinates or junior partners, but as equals who brought different capabilities to the fight. Joint operations targeted key Velcran strongholds and combined human stealth technology with Ascari psychic coordination to create attacks that neither side could have executed alone. Captain Ryan Hughes developed new fighter tactics that took advantage of how Ascari pilots could share information instantly, while human pilots provided the aggressive creativity that telepathic species sometimes lacked. His mixed squadrons hit Velcran logistics hubs and communication relays and achieved kill ratios that seemed impossible, until you watched the combat footage and saw how well the two species worked together when they stopped trying to force each other into familiar patterns. The war was turning in ways that shocked both the Velcran and the Ascari, because humanity had changed the fundamental calculus of the conflict. The Velcron were losing for the first time in generations, and their high command argued among themselves about how to respond. The Ascari were winning battles they had thought unwinnable, and their leadership began to believe that total victory over the Dominion was finally possible if they could maintain the alliance with humanity. Commander Jake Morrison, who was now Fleet Admiral, watched the progress of the war from Earth, and he saw something that worried him, which was that both sides expected the fighting to continue until one power was completely destroyed. The Ascari wanted to push their advantage and crush the Velcron entirely, while the Velcron were preparing for a desperate last stand that would cost millions more lives. Neither side was thinking about peace because after 73 years of war, they had forgotten what peace even looked like. Morrison addressed the Galactic Council with a proposal that stunned the assembled representatives, and he suggested that the war should end not through conquest, but through negotiated peace that both sides could accept. He argued that humanity had not entered this war to replace one empire with another, but to stop the killing that had claimed human lives at New Haven. They thought humans would stay out of their war. We showed them wrong. The Velcron refused the peace proposal because they believed that accepting terms from a species they had tried to intimidate would be a sign of weakness, and the Ascari also refused because they could smell total victory and wanted to see the Dominion crushed, completely after 73 years of bloodshed. The galaxy expected the war to continue and become even bloodier as humanity threw more resources behind the Ascari push, and the Velcron made their desperate last stand. Everyone was wrong about what humanity planned to do next because Admiral Wells and Fleet Admiral Morrison had been working on something that would change everything. Operation Final Dawn was the most audacious military operation in galactic history, and it required perfect coordination between human forces and Ascari allies and intelligence networks that had been building for months. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution, which was to simultaneously strike every major Velcron military installation in the same hour and demonstrate that humanity could end the Velcron Dominion entirely if they chose to do so, and then offer peace terms before delivering the killing blow. It was a calculated risk because if anything went wrong, the Velcron might interpret it as an attempt at genocide and fight to the last soldier. But Morrison believed it was the only way to shock both sides into accepting peace. Captain Lisa Bennett now commanded the diplomatic corps that would deliver the ultimatum, and she had witnessed the destruction at New Haven and carried that memory with her every day. Lieutenant Chris Palmer, who had pulled survivors from the rubble at New Haven, now led ground forces that would strike one of the primary targets. Commander Alex Turner, who had defended Terra Nova, coordinated fleet movements for the operation. Every human who had suffered from Velcron aggression was now part of the force that would end the war, and they understood that this mission was not about revenge but about ensuring no one else would suffer what they had endured. The operation required intelligence about every major Velcron military base and shipyard and command center, and humanity had spent 3 months gathering this information through reconnaissance missions and captured data and cooperation with Ascari sources. The target list included 57 installations spread across Velcron space, and each one would need to be hit within the same 60-minute window to prevent the Dominion from mounting an effective response. The timing had to be perfect, because if some targets survived, they could coordinate a counterattack that would turn the operation into a disaster. Admiral Wells assembled the largest human fleet ever, gathered with every combat-capable ship that Earth could spare and Ascari vessels that had been integrated into the command structure. She divided her forces into strike groups, with each group assigned specific targets and backup plans if primary objectives proved too heavily defended. The fleet jumped into position at 5:30 hours Galactic Standard Time and waited in designated holding areas while final intelligence updates confirmed that Velcron forces were still following their normal routines and suspected nothing. At 0600 hours, the attack began, and 57 strike groups hit their targets simultaneously, with precision that demonstrated everything humanity had learned about warfare. These were not attacks designed to cause maximum casualties, but rather surgical strikes meant to disable military capability while minimizing loss of life. Human forces targeted ship construction facilities and weapons, manufacturing plants and command bunkers, but they avoided civilian population centers and refugee camps, and anything that did not directly contribute to Velcran military power. Lieutenant Palmer led his ground team against a major command center on the Velcran colony world of Torvin, and they inserted via stealth dropships that landed 5 kilometers from the target. His soldiers moved through the terrain using night vision and thermal camouflage, and they reached the facility perimeter without being detected. The assault was fast and brutal, with human forces using shaped charges to breach the walls and stun weapons to incapacitate Velcran personnel before they could destroy critical data systems. Palmer secured the command center in 18 minutes with 0 friendly casualties and only minimal Velcran losses. Captain Ryan Hughes flew one of the most dangerous missions of the operation, which was to disable the Velcran fleet anchorage at Heston Station, where 30 capital ships were docked for repairs and resupply. His fighter wing came in fast and low, using the station structure itself as cover from defensive weapons, and they launched precision strikes that destroyed the docking clamps and power transfer systems. The Velcran ships were not destroyed, but they were crippled and unable to move or fight, and would take months to repair, even if the Dominion had the resources to do so. Commander Sophie Grant commanded a frigate group that hit Velcran supply depots along their main logistics corridor, and her ships moved like ghosts through Velcran space, destroying fuel stockpiles and ammunition bunkers and spare parts warehouses. The Velcran garrison forces tried to respond, but Grant had planned her approach vectors to maximize confusion, and by the time enemy ships arrived at each location, the human vessels were already jumping away to the next target. The simultaneous nature of the attacks created chaos in Velcran command structures, because every major installation was screaming for help at the same time, and there were no reinforcements available and no clear picture of what was happening. Velcran commanders who tried to mount counterattacks found their orders contradicted by other commanders, and their communication networks disrupted by human electronic warfare. In 1 hour, humanity had destroyed or disabled 30% of Velcran military capability and demonstrated that they could have destroyed everything if they had chosen to do so. Admiral Wells transmitted a message to every Velcran world as the last strike group reported mission success, and her face appeared on screens across the Dominion. She spoke clearly and without anger, and told them that this was not about conquest or revenge, but about ending a war that had already cost too many lives. She listed every installation that had been hit and every ship that had been disabled, and then she made an offer that shocked everyone listening. The attacks would stop immediately, and humanity would help rebuild what they had destroyed if the Velcran would agree to peace. Terms that included withdrawal from contested systems and reparations to New Haven and Terra Nova, and independent monitoring to ensure compliance. The Velcran High Command convened an emergency session, and they argued for 6 hours about whether to accept the human terms or fight to the last soldier. Some commanders wanted to reject the offer and die with honor, while others pointed out that honor meant nothing if their entire civilization was destroyed. The deciding factor was the realization that humanity had shown restraint when they could have shown ruthlessness, and that the terms being offered were far more generous than what the Ascari would demand if the war continued. The Velcran accepted the peace agreement, and for the first time in 73 years, the shooting stopped. The Ascari protested immediately because they wanted total victory and complete Velcran surrender, and the destruction of the Dominion as punishment for decades of warfare. Captain Bennett delivered humanity's response to the Ascari leadership, and she explained that Earth had not entered the war to replace one empire with another, but to stop innocent people from dying. The war was stopped, and now everyone needed to move forward and rebuild, rather than seeking revenge that would only plant seeds for future conflicts. Fleet Admiral Morrison traveled to the Velcran homeworld aboard a human vessel to personally oversee the signing of the peace treaty, and he stood in the same room as Velcran commanders who had ordered the attack on New Haven. He did not shake their hands or pretend a friendship, but he signed the documents that ended the war and committed humanity to helping enforce the peace. The treaty included provisions for demilitarized zones and arms limitations and cultural exchanges designed to prevent future misunderstandings. And most importantly, it included mechanisms for resolving disputes without violence. Lieutenant Sophie Grant, who had blockaded Velcran trade routes, now led the first joint patrol of former war zones with ships from all 3 species working together. Sergeant Nicole Brooks, who had held the line at Terra Nova, became an instructor teaching both Velcran and Ascari soldiers about human, military doctrine and the idea that overwhelming force was best used in defense of innocence rather than conquest of territory. Captain Hughes retired from active military service and joined the Galactic Council as humanities representative, where he pushed for reforms that would prevent future wars. New Haven was rebuilt over the next 5 years with Velcran, reparations funding construction, and Ascari technology helping to restore damaged infrastructure and human determination, ensuring that the colony would be stronger than before. A memorial stood in the capital city listing the names of the 12,000 dead, and beneath those names was an inscription that read simply that they thought humanity would stay out, and that humans had shown them the cost of being wrong. Admiral Wells addressed the graduating class of Earth Defense Fleet Academy 10 years after the war ended, and she spoke to young officers from Earth and from Velcran worlds and from Ascari systems who sat together learning the